So good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry to keep you waiting a little bit. You've seen our group assemble here. I should have jumped up a little bit sooner to introduce myself and the great group we've got assembled for you and this event that you've all come to attend. Let me start with myself. My name is Daniel Chow. I'm the Deputy Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center. I'm newly arrived. I was at the Pentagon prior to this as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy there. And one of the issues that was of great interest and concern to me while I was doing long-term planning and analysis for the Secretary of Defense was the issue of energy security and thinking hard about how energy security was going to shape our national security interests and challenges into the future, certainly around the world. But as we thought hard about the Asia-Pacific rebalance, in particular how energy security could shape how we thought about the Asia-Pacific region. That's why I'm particularly pleased and excited to be able to introduce this particular discussion. It's part of our Cross-Straits Series, which we do in close collaboration with our friends from TechRow, to look at energy security and the implications for the Asia-Pacific region. As you know, we think a lot about the Asia-Pacific region and what I would call fairly traditional types of security challenges in those regions. The energy aspect, I think, has been underappreciated and under-examined, and so I think this is a great opportunity for us to do that. In doing that, we've assembled quite a good group of people that I think will bring some great perspective to you and hopefully be not only very informative to you, but very engaged with your questions and some discussion afterwards. Starting with my friend and colleague Bob Manning, who is, of course, Senior Fellow here at the Scowcroft Center and is one of the foremost experts on energy security issues, including his publication lately on energy security in Asia just last year. Is that right? Or just a few months ago? Right, in particular with regard to the shale revolution. So Bob will bring that expertise to us as we go forward. We also have Mr. Edward Chow, who I'm meeting for the first time, but very glad to meet, who is a Senior Fellow for Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And as you all know, CSIS has done some great work in this particular area. So thank you for coming and looking forward to that discussion as well. Next is Ms. Meredith Miller, who is the Senior Vice President of Trade, Economic, and Energy Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Obviously well focused on these particular issues and very much looking forward to her bringing her perspective to this discussion as well. And last but not least, a good friend of mine, former colleague in the Pentagon, Dr. Van Jackson, who's visiting fellow at Center for New American Security. Not only does Van know the region extremely well, but when he worked in my office was one of the key staff members that I had working on future trends and issues, both in terms of focusing on the role of innovation, particularly for the Department of Defense, but also in looking at how long-term trends could truly change the way we think about national security in the future. So I think Van will bring some great perspective to this as well. And then, fortunately for you all, moderating this session is not me, but it's Mr. Keith Johnson, who is a senior reporter at Foreign Policy. He will help us moderate this particular discussion and then make sure that there's time as well for some questions and answers afterwards. So thank you all very much for coming. I think this is going to be a great discussion. I hope it's one that will put this issue on everybody's radar going forward and generate more discussion. We in the Scowcroft Center are certainly going to be focusing on this as an aspect of security issues international security issues that we need to be thinking of. We're going to be working closely with our friends in our Energy and Environment Center as well to ensure that we have a very holistic view and a very multidisciplinary view on this. I hope you will come. We have multiple events coming up in that vein as well. Those of you who are interested in these issues, I hope you will come and attend those events as well. We'll have some information for you outside. But again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And Keith, over to you.
Great. Fantastic. Well, listen, thanks. I did just want to preface this with one little remark. I have sort of a professional deformation since I cover energy geopolitics. So I artificially look at everything through an energy prism just so I can justify writing about stuff. But in many cases, it's actually true. And in East Asia and Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, the energy component, energy security, energy insecurity, perceptions of energy insecurity, all of that does come in to influence the larger geopolitical picture, interstate relations, and even in some cases the threat of conflict. And so I think it's a really interesting prism to look at the entire region in. And since we're running a little bit behind schedule, I think we've already got all the introductions. What I wanted to do was have our four panelists go through. Bob, you're going to give a broad overview of sort of the energy trends. Ed, if you could sort of zero in on China's energy situation, security, insecurity, and how that might affect things in the South China Sea. Meredith, the same for Southeast Asia. And Van, if you can explain everything about the Hermit Kingdom, that would be great. Fire away, Bob.
Okay. Let me just start with sort of give you some context. I think Asians tend to have a very strategic view of energy security, and almost mercantilist approach, although that's changing a bit. Everybody focuses on China and how aggressive it's been in acquiring equity oil over the world, but they learned mostly from Japan. In the 1970s, the Japanese spent somewhere between $40 and $50 billion trying to look for equity oil, and all they got out of it was 200,000 barrels in Kuwait, which was a license that was not renewed. But so it was an expensive lesson, and you've seen it. I've seen it across the board. Not just China, but India is doing the same thing. The Koreans have done a bit of it. So they're very focused on it, and I think it's not an accident, for example, that the Chinese have this new one road, one belt Eurasia strategy. One important piece of that is their concern about being dependent on the sea lanes and oil from the Middle East. So you see pipelines to Kazakhstan, to Turkmenistan, the deals with Russia. I mean, I think they're looking at that in very strategic terms. And I don't want to get into detail on the South China Sea, but I'll just say I'll just talk about the technology factor. 20 years ago, deep sea and ultra deep sea drilling capabilities didn't exist anywhere near where they are today. And so the oil and gas in the South China Sea was not really recoverable. And we can argue about how much of this is about sovereignty and how much of it is about resources. And I go back and forth on that one. Maybe Ed can shed some light on it.
Hard.
But it's important. And the other thing that people don't tend to focus on, but I think a very important factor, is the Middle East-Asia energy nexus. Asians get about 70% of Gulf Middle East oil exports go to Asia. Japanese are like 83% dependent. The Chinese have been dependent, but because of a lot of investments they've made elsewhere, it's down to, I think, in the 50 range. Projections are that that's going to go up. Koreans also, and most of the Southeast Asians, even though there are a lot of them, Malaysia, Indonesia, are oil producers, Indonesia will soon, if they haven't already, become a net oil importer. And Asia is also driving global demand. About 80% of global demand growth over the last 10 years has been in Asia. And even with the relatively slow down economies, that's still probably going to be the case over the coming decade. And I think the situation a lot of them are facing, Japan was dependent on nuclear for more than 50% of its electricity. Of all the reactors that shut down, probably not more than 5 or 6 of them, if that, are going to be restarted. So they have a huge energy gap they've been casting about to figure out how to fill. And also, I think in terms of gas, East Asia, Korea, Japan, Taiwan have been the leading importers of natural gas for a long time, and that trend is continuing. China and India didn't start importing LNG until about 10 years ago. That's ramping up rapidly. And that brings me to where I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. and how this all fits into the picture of U.S. policy. Our new energy bounty as a result of the shale revolution positions us very nicely to become more of a provider of energy security to Asia. And I think if you're thinking about the so-called rebalance and the U.S. posture in the region, I think it'll have a potentially enormous impact, because Asians already sort of doubtful about our ability to sustain our focus and commitment to the region. And I think if Congress is in the process of getting rid of outdated 1970s regulations on oil exports. Gas exports are going to begin this year. They've approved, I think, 9 LNG facilities, and there are about 22 licenses pending. And when I talk to people in a number of Asian countries, they're looking very firmly at the U.S. Being a source of future oil and gas. And I think to the degree we can do that and sort of get more deeply woven into the whole economic fabric of the region, it'll have a reassurance capability in terms of how people see the U.S. in the longer term, that if we're a greater part of the Asian economy. And because we're kind of up against it to start with, because even though U.S. trade and investment in the region it continues to increase in absolute terms, and it's declining in relative terms because China and other Asians are growing so much faster. So that's always a consideration, is sort of the whole inter-Asian dynamic becoming more important and the U.S. role becoming relatively smaller, even though it's still important and will continue to be. And I think if you're looking at that, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Asians will see energy exports. That's something that gives us leverage in these negotiations, and I think maybe a significant factor going forward. So I think that to the degree that we don't screw that up and do move forward on and there's both a direct, Asia may not be the direct market for a lot of it, but just putting more, already, for example, gas prices in Asia have gone down. The Japanese were paying about $17 now because of shale revolution. It's down to about 12, and it allows a lot of countries to renegotiate fixed gas contracts, and we've seen a lot of that all over the region. I think it's probably one of the reasons why we haven't seen any pipelines being built between China and Russia. It has to do a lot to do with differences on price. Ed can talk more authoritatively about that than I. So with that, I think I will stop there and can continue the discussion later.
Thanks, Bob. No, I think that's great, because I do want to come back later to the U.S. role in this, and especially something that we've talked about in the past, which is the nexus between U.S. policymakers and their desires and the realities of the market, which sometimes are two different things. So, Ed, enlighten us on all things China.
Thanks, Keith. As I look around the room, we have a very knowledgeable audience here, and so the last thing you need is to hear too much talk from me. So I'm just going to, and Bob's already done a good job on introducing the general landscape. I'll just drill down a couple of things on regarding China. One, it may have not been noticed very much in this town or in the United States, but last year China passed the United States as the largest net oil importer in the world, which is clearly something that's very significant from their point of view. As Bob said, last year more than 50% of that came from the Persian Gulf, which was a down year because shipments from Iran was down. So it's only going to go up. China has very ambitious programs to increase their natural gas utilization from a very, very low base today, which is around 6%, to 10% by the end of this decade. World average is 20-some% natural gas as a share of primary energy. So even that, it puts them at a relatively low range. And if you visited Beijing recently, you'll know why they want to move towards natural gas rather than continue to burn more and more coal. And about half of that gas is currently imported, and about half of the imports are LNG from the sea. So you can see that from a Chinese point of view, there is a great interest and policy emphasis on diversification of supply, but also diversification away from maritime routes, if possible. And if you don't understand why, I have a two-word answer for you. It's called the Seventh Fleet. So when you hear about Chinese interests in Russian oil and gas deals, when you hear about Chinese interests in Kazakhstan oil or Turkmen gas, there's an overall context for that interest. Plus, as Bob also mentioned, they've been investing a lot overseas, which for some reason get very bad press for them internationally. I don't really understand why, if the largest oil importer in the world is investing in oil and gas development outside of China, why that should be a bad thing. If they didn't do that, we would call them a free rider. Last time I was in China, which was the end of last year, all I heard about from everyone was President Obama calling China a free rider in the Tom Friedman column. This is something, to me, it's very natural to do. Now, how they do it, the terms of that trade is a different matter. But the fact that they're investing heavily abroad is a very natural development. They also have very ambitious plans to develop unconventional gas domestically. And when Chinese talk about unconventional gas, they're not just talking about shale gas, but they include shale gas, but also coal-bed methane, as well as what we would call tight gas. And whether they are able successfully to do that or not will have a lot to do with how big of a gas importer they become in the long run. The question is, will the Chinese sort of heavy footprint on importing gas have a similar impact on the global gas market in the future as they did to the global oil market in the past 5, 6, 7 years? And a lot depends on their ability to grow domestic gas production, an area where the U.S. and China has some common interests and an area that we can cooperate on. But it's messy in China right now. It's all wrapped up in the question of state-owned enterprise reform, which started out as a priority for the Xi Jinping administration when they came in 2 years ago. There is some interesting debates in the Chinese press just in the last this year on whether China should be creating a super major. Talk about combining CNPC, which is the largest company right now, with Sinopec to create the Chinese ExxonMobil. I mean, that's a shorthand way of thinking about it. Or should they be breaking up the companies and for example, spinning off the pipeline company from CNPC in particular, the pipeline assets? There seemed to be an active debate going on in the midst of a widespread anti-corruption campaign in China, where CNPC in particular has been very much a target from Zhou Yongkang down. The oil sector is in the middle of this widespread and deep anti-corruption campaign. So one of the questions is how much political control is the party willing to let go and to have commercial enterprises develop inside China. Since this program is about Cross-Straits, permit me to tell one war story. When I was with Chevron in Beijing in 1999, I took a trip from Beijing to Taipei. And In those days, you couldn't fly directly. Now there are probably 20 flights a day between the mainland and Taipei. But so you had to go through Hong Kong in those days. With the blessing of the China National Oil Corporation, to see if Chinese Petroleum Corporation of Taiwan would be willing to do cross-straits exploration together, with Chevron being the operator, and CNOOC and CPC of Taiwan, which was founded in Shanghai, by the way, as partners in that deal. Well, and the mainland Chinese were very eager to go forward with this, but the then Taiwan government was not as interested. So this question of state control, as Bob mentioned, it's a problem throughout this region. It's true in Korea, true in Japan. Meredith will talk about the state companies in Southeast Asia, and the fact that there is this strongly political direction of companies that are supposed to be involved in economic enterprises restricts the development of a true market in Asia, of free trading of petroleum products. Why wouldn't, for example, Taiwan and a Chinese company on the mainland go together on a joint LNG purchase agreement with Australia? I mean, that would be the kind of thing a normal commercial company would think about. Why couldn't you share strategic stock? China is busy building strategic stock when Japan has too much strategic stock that have grown. And why their demand has gone down. In a normal commercial operation, you would say, well, why couldn't you buy an option on Japanese strategic stock or lease part of the Japanese strategic stock while you're building your own? But it's a very much of a state-by-state operation that restricts trading in Asia in general and sort of hamper the development of a true market. The result of which the Persian Gulf countries have been able to charge what has traditionally been called an Asian premium on crude exports to Northeast Asia, and particularly after Fukushima, a LNG premium as well. So this is at an economic disadvantage. So politics get in the way. I never realized until I was sent by Chevron from San Francisco to Beijing that Chevron's first name was America. Because everywhere I went in China, it was American Chevron Company. It was never just Chevron, right? So you always carry the flag with you, and that does restrict commercial and enterprise. One last word on the South China Sea, and I'll shut up. I think Hillary Clinton was completely wrong when she said at Georgetown University a few years ago that the South China Sea was all about oil and gas. The last thing the South China Sea is about is oil and gas. The South China Sea is about sovereignty. It's about sea lanes of communication. It's even about fishery before it is about oil and gas. No one in the wildest imagination, and I know a lot of geologists who have very wild imagination, can think that China would discover 6 to 7 million barrels per day that they are importing currently in the South China Sea. It's just not about oil and gas. It's about a lot of other things. Now, this is putting a platform next to Vietnam a provocation? Absolutely. But oil and gas is not the most important thing at stake in the South China Sea. But Meredith can correct me if I'm wrong.
Great. No, thanks, Ed, because that's actually one thing I wanted to dive into a little bit more is the difference between reality and perception when it comes to the role energy plays in the region. Meredith, for Southeast Asia.
Great. Well, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for having me here and also for including Southeast Asia as a particular focus in this panel discussion. The story in Northeast Asia, as we've heard already from Bob and Ed, is so dramatic, and the same is true for India, that sometimes Southeast Asia is overshadowed in these discussions, but it's actually becoming a very significant center for global energy demand, and the decisions that the countries there make about their energy mix are going to have a big impact on Asia writ large and also the environmental outlook for the region. It's also challenging to talk about Southeast Asia in 10 minutes because it's 10 countries. They are a very, 1 minute each, they're a very diverse group of countries, some of the wealthiest countries in the world and some of the poorest. They have very different endowments in terms of their energy supplies domestically. But I'm going to just, to kick off our discussion, make a few sweeping statements about trends in the region. First is that Southeast Asia has continued to post very positive economic growth. So for this year, that's 4.9%. Next year, 5.4%, according to ADB. And that's translated into very dramatic projections for increase in energy demand. The region as a whole also still consumes far less than other parts of the world, about half in terms of looking at per person use of energy. So there's a lot of room for development there. So what we see in looking at projections for the region by 2035 is a very sharp uptick in demand. Basically, I think the IEA put it as, imagine taking Japan and adding a new Japan to the global energy mix. That's Southeast Asia through 2035. So the region is increasingly challenged in terms of finding the energy supplies to meet that demand and sustain economic growth, putting the infrastructure in place. Estimates are about $100 billion are needed in Southeast Asia, 60% of that in the power sector, just to keep that trajectory going forward. And the environmental implications are also quite large. So on the demand side, overall, import dependency is going to go up. By 2035, Southeast Asia will be the fourth largest importer of oil in the world. So, as Bob pointed out, most of that is coming from the Gulf region, and the region will increasingly be exposed and I think thinking more internationally about their energy security outlook. Coal consumption is also increasing quite rapidly in terms of its role in the energy mix. It's going to go up to about 50% in the future. It's set to triple in that time period, so very dramatic increase. And also gas demand is going up, an estimated 80%. So overall, what we're going to see is less exports from Southeast Asia to other parts of the region. So the region's traditionally been an important source of coal for Northeast Asia, for India, also for gas, and historically for oil. Those resources are going to be used more within the ASEAN region going forward. Along with that increase in import dependency means that countries are also facing a lot more fiscal pressures. Many of them still have subsidies in place that are an increasing burden as you start acquiring your energy supplies on the world market. There's also very important environmental implications of this increase in demand. So for the Asian Development Bank, they've estimated that Southeast Asia's CO2 emissions are projected to double. They've also said that for each 10% increase in CO2 emissions, this is a broader statistic for Asia, you see 64 million people in the region being pushed into poverty. And overall, that economic development piece is something that commands the attention of leaders throughout the region. A lot of the growth in Southeast Asia is coming from the power sector, which is why you see coal increasing so rapidly as a part of the energy mix. And that is something where I think there's a lot of room for collaboration with the United States and with other countries in the region. Maybe I'll just wrap up in talking generally about Southeast Asia by saying that I think there are some important ways that the U.S. energy revolution is impacting this picture in terms of import dependency and on the climate change mitigation side, which, as I mentioned, is going to be an increasing financial burden for the region. One is the dip in oil prices that has allowed for some subsidy reforms in Indonesia and Malaysia in particular. Vietnam and Thailand have also made some moves to reduce that burden on their budgets, and also overall, the removal of those subsidies helps to increase and improve the efficiency outlook. Secondly, on the coal side, as I mentioned, very dramatic increase in coal in Southeast Asia. Most of the plants that are being built there are not using the best technology available. Most of them are being built on a shoestring, and I think that there's a lot more that the international community could do to provide for financing to make sure that if coal-fired plants are being put in place, that they are burning the coal as efficiently as possible with the least amount of CO2 emissions. On the gas side, Ed and Bob both mentioned the Asian premium and the historical link to oil prices. As more U.S. exports come into the market, and there's the opportunity to acquire more gas in the Asian region that's linked to Henry Hub prices, I think there is potential for gas to become more competitive vis-a-vis coal on a price basis. And that's a very important development as we look at that very steep demand curve in the region. One more point on oil, that dependence on the Middle East. I think that means that a lot more people in Asia are going to be watching very closely the debate here in the United States about whether or not we lift the current ban that we have on crude oil exports in terms of diversifying the global market. And last but not least, on the climate mitigation side, tropical countries are going to be hit particularly hard. There are major metropolitan parts of Southeast Asia that the ADB and UN have identified as being particularly prone to flooding. And there's a lot more, I think, that the US could be doing in collaborating with partners in the region. There's an increasing awareness. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is talking about their next phase for regional economic integration. And for the first time, they've identified the environment as being a key pillar of that. And I'll stop there. On South China Sea, let me just say, I 100% agree with Ed. When you look at commercial security implications, what happens with the fisheries is far more important to the coastal populations in the region than the really incremental contribution in terms of oil and gas demand that could come from the resources there. And the disputes are a real obstacle to proper management of those resources, which is incredibly unfortunate.
I'd love to come back to fish with you in Southeast Asia when we finish up. Dan?
Great. So what I have to say, I think nests well with what everybody said, actually. I see kind of a good news, bad news story if you step back and look at the big Asia energy picture, especially for Japan and Korea, and how that picture intersects with Asia's security trends. So Japan and Korea have obviously specific circumstances, but their problems and prospects, with a few very important caveats, kind of echo the broader Asia-Pacific's problems and prospects when it comes to energy. And so the good news is that Japan and Korea, like ASEAN nations, like China actually, have a common interest in securing a more stable energy supply because they all share dependence, right, on imports. They all are vulnerable to market disruptions. And when you talk to people in the region, Ed, I'm sure everybody's talked to people in the region, there's a general acknowledgement that that is like the rational thing to say, right? And so this is a good thing. There's a widely acknowledged common interest. And in theory, that should be sufficient to pursue regional infrastructure projects, regional architectures for energy, right? That should promote stability. And then that might help contain or drive down market prices. And so there are a number of structural conditions on top of this common interest that also suggest a cause for optimism when you look at Japan and Korea's energy outlook, when you look at the region's energy outlook. Japan and Korea are both making big R&D bets in renewables. Japan is skewing towards solar. South Korea is skewing towards hydroelectric. But it's a diverse investment portfolio in renewables. It is a small bit of their portfolio, but it's there. They're making the bets. Japan and Korea are both facing demographic crises. So normally this is not a good thing, but it suggests at least that aggregate energy consumption demand from these countries has probably peaked. So it's another good thing. And then what everybody has talked about, what everybody in this room probably knows, the US has the potential to be a game changer as we become a net exporter, right? So Japan and Korea have both made explicit their intention to substitute or diversify away from Middle East imports in favor of US imports to the extent that they can. So the US is the supplier of choice for Japan and Korea. And they've put their money where their mouth is to some extent. They've started importing US shale gas and condensate, refined product. And so there are all these things on the positive side of the ledger for Japan and Korea looking forward, but there are a bunch of negative things too. So I think Bob mentioned it, but U.S. law is still constraining U.S. export potential, and that may change. It feels like there's a groundswell, but it hasn't changed yet, right? And Japan and Korea, their demand on Middle East oil is so high that even optimistic projections of U.S. export capacity probably won't completely displace or eliminate their reliance on Middle East oil. It'll just mitigate it or reduce it. And then most importantly, and this is really why I'm here, there are some big trends in the region relating to security and geopolitics that are trumping market incentives and that are trumping collective interests, right? If everybody can come around the table, they have summit meetings, they know that there's like a common dependence and that cooperation could achieve some sort of positive sum outcome, but it's not happening. And so the bad news is that Asian national strategies for energy security are shaped and shoved to some degree by geopolitics. And it has the effect of zero-sum thinking and zero-sum policies. Bob used the word mercantilist. I think that's totally right. And so what do I mean? One of the bigger exogenous trends that's shaping Asian energy on the whole, and Japan and Korea in particular, is what a lot of Asia hands talk about as like the Asian paradox. So it's this phenomenon of simultaneous warm economic relations and frigid geopolitical tensions between the same actors, right? And so putting it another way, Asian policy elites are putting up this one-way firewall, the politicians, separating economic calculations on the one hand and national security strategy on the other. And there are exceptions to this, but this is happening in a lot of countries, not just Japan and Korea. And this serves a positive purpose. Effectively, this allows trading relations to flourish even while you don't trust each other, even while you're in competition with one another, even while you're stoking historical rivalries, right? The problem, or one of many problems potentially with this, is that when you have multi-dimensional issues like energy, where it's inherently part economic and part security, like how do you separate those things, right? The nationalist security imperative in places like the South China Sea and in between Japan-Korea relations, there's no love lost between them, that trumps economic logic sometimes. And that can be very frustrating, especially for market watchers, right? So this paradoxical trend helps explain several, what would be on the face of them, puzzles in Asian energy, right? So why does Japan and Korea pursue sort of self-defeating mercantilist strategies? Why do they take their national oil companies and compete with other national oil companies to lock in trade routes, to lock in supply sources when there's only one oil market, right? If there's a supply disruption to the region, the market sets the price. I think that's how it works. So you might have locked down a source that's just yours, right? But it's still going to respond to market incentives. So you're shooting yourself in the foot to some extent. Why engage in that kind of competition? Why is Japan in particular keen, happy to lock in 30-year LNG contracts in the Middle East? Does that not create a more rigid gas market? What is the benefit of a rigid gas market? Doesn't that make you more vulnerable? Why are China and India some of the biggest energy consumers, not part of the IEA? This is the only multilateral energy solution in town that I'm aware of right now. There's potential for more, right? But that's it. And then why is there no gas pipeline running from Russia through China to the Koreas and then back down? Diversify supply, right? Build a more resilient infrastructure. So bottom line, despite economic incentives that should be spurring regional cooperation, the logic is there. I feel like everybody sees it. Why aren't Japan, Korea, China working on a common economic or energy solution, right? Collective emergency stocks, a buyer's cartel, something. Right. You're not seeing, you see some talk about some of these things, but you don't see the outcomes, right? And so in all of these questions, geopolitics is a big part of the answer. There are more specific explanations in every case, but the Asian paradox, more specifically, plays a big role in helping understand why things are the way they are, the absence of collective action. And so there's this underappreciated political risk facing the region, and it's that Asian policy elites are behaving as especially, I'm focusing on Japan and Korea, as if national security overrides economic considerations, and that economic considerations don't have the opposite effect. They don't go that far in constraining national security calculations. And as long as that's the case, collective action to solve collective problems is going to continue to be hard to impossible. So this is a big system-level problem. And so I guess I'm saying that having this, what we've had the last few decades, which has given us a prosperous region, especially for Japan and Korea, they've benefited. Hot economics and cold politics side by side is fine. It's been fine, and it'll continue to be fine until it's not fine. Economic interdependence can't make the region more peaceful if there's a firewall insulating political and security decision-making from those economic incentives. And so that's my concern. So maybe it's unfounded, right? I'm getting something off my chest. But that's my concern, is that whatever optimism there is on the horizon for Japan and Korean energy security, and I think there is some, that's what I started the remarks with, that optimism is taking place within a context of Asian nationalism, pervasive mistrust, strategic and military competition. If you don't think that's true, look at the military spending trends, military modernization programs across the region. I'm happy to talk about that too. But so the good news, or if you can call it good news, is that Japan-Korea cooperation, again, no love lost between these guys, is the Sinatra test, in my mind, the hard test for regional energy solutions. So any Japan-Korea collaboration that might be possible should be able to extend to Southeast Asia if there's a common interest there. It should be able to include China in theory. And so Japan and Korea, to me, are more of a litmus test for what's possible within the region. And if Japan and Korea can't collaborate to solve a common energy problem that they have, then I don't know what hope there is for the region. So,
wow. Thank you very much. This has been great stuff. We could actually do 4 panels, I think, on this. But what I wanted to do, in order to save some time for some questions, I did want to take the prerogative for a couple of follow-ups here. And actually first with something that pretty much everyone spoke to, which is this tension between a mercantilist approach or a statist approach, government political interference, versus free market or relatively commercial operations of energy. And I think everyone pretty much spoke to this. In the past, obviously, there was a big school of thought in China about a sort of a mercantilist approach. It seemed as if market energy solutions were gaining the upper hand for a while. You've talked about it in Northeast Asia. So the questions are sort of where's the trend line actually really going on that front? What impacts, Ed, do the internal Chinese restructurings of the energy firms ultimately have there, do you think? I mean, are they going to break these up, make them more nimble commercial players, or is it just going to shift the political onus to a different SOE? And ultimately, what role can the U.S. energy revolution play there? I mean, the U.S. nominally is purely commercial players. That's not the U.S. government selling energy, right? So to what extent can U.S. government or U.S. involvement as an energy exporter sort of accelerate this move towards a more market-oriented Asian energy sphere? Jump in, please.
I've got 2 trips to China planned in the next 3 weeks, so invite me back in a month and I'll tell you the answer. I feel like China is, as far as restructuring the oil and gas sector is concerned, is at a crossroad. And I'm not sure they've decided quite what to do, which is why we're hearing some of these tri-balloons, or whatever the Chinese term for tri-balloons would be, being floated for the past 2-3 months now. China was at a similar crossroad once before. Back 15 years ago or so, under the Jiang Zemin Zhurongji administration, 3 horizontal monopolies, namely CNPC, which was the onshore production company, Sinopec, which was the onshore refining company, and CNOOC, which was the offshore company, got restructured, and they became vertically integrated companies able to compete with each other. They also had started floating shares in the market. And the direction was rather hopeful in the sense that competition, capital markets were going to start disciplining these companies. Unfortunately, under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, that direction stalled. And I'm not sure I understand the reasons why. So they became rather comfortable cartel as opposed to real companies competing with each other. So we're at a crossroad now where things could develop in a different way. As long as the party's personnel department selects who's going to be the next CEO of CNPC, it seems that being the next ExxonMobil is a bit far off yet. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. If you think about how Asian industries have prospered over the last 3-4 decades, they prospered because they became internationally competitive. And it was the international market that disciplined, because they were export-oriented economies, you had to produce products that were internationally competitive, even if you're mercantilistic inside your country. That's not where the Chinese industry is at yet. But they're venturing overseas in order to compete with the ExxonMobils of the world. You have to tell the Nigerians why they should select you rather than ExxonMobil for completely above the table reasons. And that case needs to be made. The thing that you can do to really ruin a good company is to give them home turf advantage. I mean, Petrobras is the most recent example of a perfectly functioning oil company that got spoiled because the Brazilian government gave them home field advantage on the deep offshore pre-salt plays. If you don't believe me, look at Pemex, look at PDVSA. Chinese companies need to become internationally competitive first rather than just bulking up. And how they achieve that, I think, is what the Chinese leadership is struggling with, along with a lot of other things at the same time.
Well, I would just say, if you put that in the context of the agenda that Xi Jinping has adopted in terms of radical market reforms, that would argue for breaking them up. And if they don't do that, it makes you wonder how serious the Chinese are about these reforms. That's one thing. Across the region, I don't see any particular changes. I think they're looking to the U.S., and I think there'll be, and certainly it'll impact the market in either in direct terms and or direct terms. But I don't think their views about energy have changed that much. I think what may change things a bit is whether or not we're at a tipping point in terms of wind and solar. If we have new storage capacity, if this new Tesla battery turns out to be something that lowers prices and increases storage capability, the Chinese have invested billions in wind and solar, even though they're still 70% dependent on coal for electricity. And that could change the way they think about it because they could become a lot less dependent on the petroleum economy. But there you're looking at a 15, 20-year timeline. But this is the problem. I don't accept that there's a firewall between economics and security. I'd say it's more like schizophrenia. And I'm not sure it's sustainable. In fact, a friend of mine, I wrote an article on foreign policy that got a lot of attention a couple of years ago called The Two Asias. And the whole point is that you have the security Asia and economic Asia, and they're going in exactly opposite directions. Asia's becoming more integrated, You see this explosion of free trade agreements, a growth of inter-Asian trade and investment, and at the same time, skyrocketing military spending across the region. I think last year Asia surpassed, for the first time in the modern era, surpassed Europe in military spending. And so I'm not sure how you can sustain those trends over time.
Yes, sir.
I totally agree. That's completely right. It's empirically right, too. You can point to evidence time and time again that shows this fissure, the bifurcation of the regional order into economic and security spheres. The question is when you have nexus issues. So like you're describing it as schizophrenia, it's a reasonable characterization. But when you have an issue that falls into both lanes, which trumps which? And I don't have a lot of evidence for this right now, but my intuition is that national security is going to end up trumping economics because of these historically derived tensions, because of history and the role that it plays in political legitimacy, which is what the elites care about most. But, I mean, I'm guessing.
I wanted to take the opportunity just to follow up on one thing that Meredith said, because I don't think this gets a whole lot of attention here, which is the vulnerability of Southeast Asia from the environmental front with changes. Secretary Kerry, on his trip to Vietnam, I think in late 2013, highlighted some of the threats to the lower Mekong region, both from man-made climate change and man-made changes upstream, big dam building exercises. And basically the fear that I think the Secretary spoke of and that I know a lot of developmental folks speak of, there's 60 million people or so at risk food-wise in the Mekong Delta. Is this on the radar screen in the right places? What can the U.S. and other developed countries do to sort of mitigate that, which seems like a real nightmare for the region?
Yeah. I'm really happy to be able to say that I think the issue of the Mekong region has risen on the U.S. policy agenda, and it's certainly one that is a very high level of focus in capitals around the Mekong region, and is starting to be so more in terms of Southeast Asia as a grouping. China has also begun to engage more in discussions around the Mekong region, but there's still a huge asymmetry in that relationship and problems in terms of upstream damming. It's an area where I think the U.S. has a positive contribution to make in terms of bringing those countries together to coordinate. I remember a couple of years ago we had a meeting in Hanoi and we were talking about hydropower. Right. And even in a very small session where we had the Lao, the Cambodians, the Vietnamese, it got very, very heated between the Laotians and the Cambodians and the Vietnamese because hydropower is an increasingly important export for some of those smaller countries as well. So it's a very challenging issue in terms of both food security, the fisheries management piece, but also the farmland surrounding that region is quite at risk from climate change. Right. More broadly, the Philippines is chairing one of the committees in the UNFCCC talks on vulnerable populations, and they've recently begun advocating for an increase in the level of ambition. So rather than a 2% increase in temperatures, a 1.5% increase in temperatures. And there's been a lot of research done on what a tremendous difference that would make, particularly in the archipelago nations of the Philippines and Indonesia, but also in the lower Mekong subregion. One point on the state-owned enterprises in Southeast Asia, if I can, I think it's an interesting question to think about in terms of the differences between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, you also have a very high degree of government ownership and management of the energy sector and the power sector. But the only really, I would say, significant international company from that part of the world is Petronas from Malaysia. The others have been very focused within their own economies. And the dynamic that you see there, I think, especially going forward with this increased trajectory in energy demand, is rising resource nationalism, particularly in Indonesia, which has been a very important exporter. But especially under new President Jokowi, is looking for ways that they can use more of their resources at home and also develop associated industries that are going to help the Indonesian economy. There's a real challenge in doing that with a state-led approach, which can create a lot of inefficiencies. And all the infrastructure that's needed is not yet in place to make that happen. So it's an interesting balancing act that some of the countries in the region are going through right now.
Fantastic. I didn't know if we had any questions from the audience. If not, I've certainly got a few more of my own. Yes, sir. As always, if you can phrase it in the form of something resembling a question with your affiliation, that'd be great.
Mike Basetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Mr. Chow, can you elaborate a bit on the effect of the China water problem in terms of them the water shortage problem in terms of them developing fracking and the other processes that you referred to?
Well, in terms of fracking, the most prospective areas are in Sichuan and Xinjiang. Xinjiang doesn't have a lot of water. Sichuan is seismically active. So there are challenges, shall we say. I don't think water by itself is necessarily a problem. We're in very early days in looking at unconventional gas in China. They're also going through a period of pricing reform on gas, and that would help a great deal. Technology could be a solution in terms of reusing frack water, also waterless fracking people are working on. But it's just too early to know whether the Chinese are going to be successful or not. I would say one other thing, which was not part of your question, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is that I'm not sure that large companies working on unconventional gas is the way to go necessarily. The experience in North America is small, medium-sized companies who are more nimble, more experimental, more entrepreneurial, have been the ones who led the shale gas revolution. There's another structural problem that China has, which is it does not have a independent oil field equipment and services industry, which is also very helpful in North America in driving efficiency and costs down to improve the economics of fracking. China doesn't have that. China have basically, the majors have in-house service companies, and they're kind of tied to using their in-house services. So there are lots of things about the structure of the Chinese industry today that looks very dissimilar from North American industry, and whether you can do fracking with Chinese characteristics or not, I don't know. They're trying very hard. I wouldn't bet against them, given the Chinese record in the last 30, 40 years, but they will have to work around those problems, including water, in order to achieve the success that they wish to achieve.
If I could just follow up on that point for a second, because what was it, last August or so, the Chinese government slashed their targets for shale production basically in half in best case scenario, right? In part because of these difficulties. Is there any possibility the shale gas difficulties are playing into decisions about Chinese corporate restructuring? I mean, is that in the back of the minds, or is it more about anti-corruption and much bigger pictures?
I just think the situation is very fluid right now. In the second round of unconventional gas tender that they had, they opened it up to independent companies. So not just foreign companies, but Chinese private companies. So you can imagine if you had Chinese entrepreneurs getting involved. Let's say you are a provincial industry that is highly energy intensive, cement industry, glass industry, and so on. And you know the local officials really well, by definition, compared to a multinational coming from overseas, working with a bunch of boys, good old boys from Oklahoma City. Maybe that's the way to go, rather than a Sinopec Shell joint venture in Sichuan, which had been the model. So I really think that they're experimenting, and which is a good thing.
Right. Okay. Right. Ambassador.
Dick Morningstar, Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. Building on the fracking discussion, but also looking generally at exploration and production and American technical capabilities, do you see any opportunities for cooperation between American and Chinese companies on projects, either in China, I know Chevron's had some experience on that, or in Central Asia or in other places, or is it just something that for the political reasons and differences in business culture is just not going to happen?
I think that the opportunities are there. And I think the opportunities need to be seized upon. And the problem is not only on their side, but on our side as well. I mean, if a Western company ever gets an onshore concession in Turkmenistan, and we may all be waiting a long time, but if it ever happens, the highest value market for that gas may indeed be China. And China's already pre-built the pipelines for it. So why wouldn't, for a purely commercial point of view, you wouldn't ship that gas to China if that's the logical market? And it may take a while before you can develop alternative markets, which, as you know very well, Turkmenistan's also be interested in. But you're not going to ship 5-10 BCM to India. You need a lot larger scale than that. So the immediate market may very well be China. So if you were able to take politics out of it, which is very difficult, as all of us have said, I think. The problem is that governments use the excuse that oil and gas is so strategic that they must control it. And that actually often gets in the way of sound commerce, in my mind.
Yeah, I think that.
Go ahead, please.
I think that's a factor because American companies have technology that the Chinese don't have, at least not yet. And the concern that the Chinese will rip them off if they go in is a big factor. And the flip side of that is, are the Chinese willing to really, one of the big problems is the Chinese just don't believe in markets. That's why they're pursuing the energy policy they've pursued. And are they serious enough about reform to let markets determine it, let companies with the technology in and give them a piece of the action they want as an incentive? And that's a big question mark, it seems to me.
This happened with the renewable energy sector, right? I mean, a lot of U.S. firms got burned terribly badly on intellectual property in China. I mean, is that sort of a cautionary tale then for any other?
It's exactly the same. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Anya? If you have a microphone.
Anya Grigas, Truman National Security Project. Who do you think is going to be the most likely supplier of gas to China? Will it be U.S. LNG exports, Turkmen gas, or Russian gas? Or do you expect that there will be a mix of all three going forward?
One of the questions I go around China asking Chinese is, why aren't you invested in U.S. LNG terminals? India is a buyer. Other countries are buying. Why aren't you involved? And they give me a very, very vague answer. So you would suspect that they believe that there is some kind of barrier to their participation, which may or may not be there. I think Chinese have really overlearned the lesson of the Unocal debacle, which was very unfortunate for them. They didn't understand what really happened, and they think it was all politics, and it wasn't just about politics. So they've ventured in Canada. They're involved in some of the West Coast, Canadian West Coast LNG projects, including one that Petronas was the operator on. I think they're interested in the Chevron project in BC as well. But so far, they have not done this. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't buy the cargoes once they hit the Pacific from Mitsubishi or someone else. But so far they have been pretty hesitant. Of course, as I know you know, they're already importing gas from Turkmenistan, maybe 25 BCM or so last year, slated to grow to 65 and higher. They're pre-building the pipeline capacity, so probably something close to that will happen. I wrote an article on Monday that everyone should read about the unspoken disappointment of Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow last weekend, and the dogs that didn't bark on the oil and gas deals. So I think Russia has been a disappointment from a Chinese point of view. Of course, a lot of things have changed since the deal was signed in Shanghai in May of last year, which may get in the way. But doing business, when I talk to my Chinese colleagues, they always say that doing business with the Russians are terribly difficult. And kind of interesting for the Chinese to say to me that all commercial disputes have to be raised to the highest political level before they can be solved, and you just can't do normal business. So, but I think the strategic reasons why both sides are interested in that gas trade is very compelling. So I don't underestimate that it will get done. It will just take a lot longer than they say right now. I don't know if I sufficiently evaded your question or not.
Yes. Do we have more? Yes, I have a question over here, then one over here. Hang on, first over here, and then we'll get this gentleman on the
Thank you. I'm Dan Millison. I'm an independent consultant. Actually, I have two questions. Meredith, could you quantify your numbers on the coal-fired power growth? I mean, business as usual is, I've seen something like 1,000 gigawatts. I think it's going to be more like half of that. And a question for anybody that wants to take it. I have a colleague who's been telling me, oh, there's all this back channel stuff about Alaska trying to export LNG to Japan, and that's part of TPP. Is that guy smoking something, or I mean, does anyone else hear about that? Because I don't. The context is I don't see shale gas coming out of the Gulf of Mexico or the East Coast being able to compete on price when it goes all the way over to the Western Pacific. Putting more into the market, of course, helps, but the more logical thing that I can see is conventional gas from Alaska going to Japan, which is the only current LNG exports from the U.S. to anywhere right now. Thanks.
And if I could actually just layer onto that and make it a real triple-barreled, the prospect for U.S. LNG exports in a period of lowish oil prices. I mean, how does that affect, given oil-gas linkages in most markets worldwide, and the portfolio gas nature of most of the LNG contracts in the U.S., what does cheapish oil do to LNG export prospects for anyone who wants to dive in?
Do you want me to do the
Yes.
coal question first? Which I don't have a great answer for. I was using the IEA business as usual statistics for that, which show 50% of the coal-fired power plants by 2035, 50%, sorry, of the power sector coming from coal by 2035, which I think is around the lines of what you laid out, but I'd have to look up the exact. And I should say Dan has done a lot of interesting work on this, showing not business as usual scenarios, so he's a great person to talk to on this topic.
Any ideas on gas prospects here?
It's tricky because one of the consequences of the shale revolution is gas. The gas price has traditionally been linked to oil, and that linkage is coming apart, and so it's not clear where gas prices are going to go. Asia has also been a very fragmented gas market. There was an IEA study not long ago about calling for an Asian hub that would consolidate things a bit. But there hasn't been much progress on that. I would note that at least one West Coast LNG facility in Oregon has been approved. So if you're looking at transportation as a factor and gas, that could also. And I think there's one other one on the West Coast that's under consideration. So, but you're right. I think Alaska's. In fact, that's the only place it makes sense to export Alaska gas to is Japan.
the driver for gas export is 250 Henry hub price,
Right.
right? I mean, that's the real driver for it. And given the price differential between European LNG markets and Asian LNG markets, that gas is going to go to Asia. If we export, that gas is going to go to Asia more than it will go to Europe. And really, the question is, will the low U.S. domestic gas price be maintained or not? I would say that very cleverly, companies like Cheniere have given the buyer the price risk rather than the terminal operator. We'll see. On Alaska, that gas has been stranded up in the North Slope for the last 30, 40 years, and the financial barriers are very high on getting that gas. The Cook Inlet gas that was Phillips LNG is a completely different set of gas, and that area now is short of gas. So bringing North Slope gas on is companies interested in monetizing a stranded asset, supplying domestic Alaska needs, and the only possible home for that gas, if it ever is brought into production, is Northeast Asian market. So that there is very much a linkage. I don't know how much is linked to PTT. I mean, TPP, I guess. I may differ a little bit with Bob on how much LNG exports has to do with TPP. We can export gas to Korea right now if we had the gas, since they are FTA country. It is very important for domestic Japanese political reasons to say that as part of TPP, we will get American gas. That's a political argument to try to dampen the political opposition among the agricultural communities and so on in Japan on the trade-offs of what Japan's going to get. But in terms of real trade, I don't know how much impact it really will have.
Got one question over here.
So, Doug Hengel, the German Marshall Fund. I'd like to hear a little more about nuclear in the region. I think a comment was made that Japan's not going to restart more than a handful of their plants. Is that really likely to be the case? Is China has a huge number of plants planned or under construction or planned. Is that all going to go ahead? What about Korea and others in the region?
Yep. Well, I mean, the Japan question, I mean, just post-Fukushima, all eyes are on Japan, right?
Yeah, well, so before Fukushima, they were aiming at a target of eventually having 50% of their electricity coming from nuclear, right? And then it's been effectively zero the last couple of years. And now Abe is interested in getting it to maybe 15% instead of 50%. But there's still a huge nuclear allergy. So you'd be fighting a movement, a grassroots movement inside Japan to make that happen. But this, again, how much do elites control? How much does this fall into the national security bucket in Japan's own domestic politics? So nuclear will probably, if they can overcome civil society preferences, will become a bigger part than zero for Japan, and that will displace some of its fossil fuel needs that it has now. And then for Korea, it's like, I think nuclear is 25% and growing. We just had a civil, nuclear reprocessing agreement with them. That, I think, is a source of diversity for them in the future.
Bob?
Yeah, I think China is really the only place that's making a big bet on nuclear. I think in Taiwan, the government wants to build, I think, another plant, but there's a lot of grassroots opposition, so I'm skeptical that's going to happen. I think Korea, there's more public acceptance, but there's no great plans for a big expansion of their nuclear. And Japan, I think, is just off the table for the foreseeable future. So, and a lot of it has to do with the changing economics. Nuclear requires enormous amounts of upfront capital. And if you're competing with an LNG spot market or renewables as battery storage improves, that's a big factor, in a country making that kind of decision. So I think other than China, I don't see much expansion in the region.
I think it's really interesting to watch the growing environmental movement in China. I mean, it's true that China has by far the largest nuclear reactor fleet that's currently under construction. But in terms of new plants that's on the drawing board, siting is going to be a real challenge, and this is very broad. It has to do with, air pollution, water pollution, land use disputes in China. The most recent paraxylene fire that was in southern China. There is a growing environmental movement in China that will make the very ambitious nuclear plants very hard to implement, I believe. So something to watch.
Meredith?
I was going to say, in Southeast Asia, there's been a lot more attention and focus discussion of nuclear energy. Malaysia, in particular, looking at very maturing oil and gas fields. But the social license issues, the environmental movement have been prohibitive so far, except in Vietnam, where they are moving ahead with developing nuclear energy with both Russia and Japan.
And the
It's still
Indonesians,
very incremental.
the Indonesians have talked about it.
The Indonesians have been talking about it as well. But
Well, a lot of countries talk about nuclear, right?
We do too.
Fantastic. Listen, this has been a fantastic discussion. I wish we had another couple of hours. I'm not sure you all do, but we could go on forever. I wanted to thank the Atlantic Council. I wanted to thank our panelists for a great discussion. Thank you.